The woman who ran from her shadow. Eleanor Hale stepped off the stagecoach into the New Mexico dust with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a lie she'd told herself for 300 miles, that she was here for employment, nothing more. The rancher waiting at the depot stood silent as stone, hat shadowing eyes that had seen too much loss. Behind him, 3 children stared at her with the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. "You're the teacher?" he asked, voice rough as the territory itself. Eleanor nodded, throat tight. He gestured toward the wagon. "Good, because they've been waiting for a mother since mine died, and I'm done pretending we don't need one." The earth seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She'd come here to disappear. Instead, she'd walk straight into the one role she'd been told she could never fill. If you want to see how Eleanor's story unfolds in the unforgiving New Mexico territory, stay with me until the very end. And please, hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see just how far this story of second chances travels across the world. The stagecoach had rattled Eleanor's bones for 6 days straight, each mile taking her further from Boston's brick propriety and deeper into a landscape so vast it made her previous life feel like something viewed through the wrong end of a telescope. Small, distant, belonging to someone else entirely. She pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching New Mexico territory unfold in shades of amber and rust. The land stretched endless and indifferent, punctuated by sage and rock formations that looked like monuments to old battles. The other passengers, a whiskey drummer and a cattle buyer, had disembarked at earlier stops, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the rhythmic creak of wood and leather. The advertisement had been precise in its simplicity. Widowed rancher seeks educated woman for household management and children's instruction. Room, board, and wages provided. Remote location. References required. Eleanor had responded within the hour, her pen moving across the paper with the desperate efficiency of someone who understood that hesitation meant staying put. Staying meant enduring another pitying glance from her former fiancé's mother at church. Staying meant another well-meaning friend suggesting she accept her condition with grace. Staying meant slowly suffocating under the weight of a single word that had come to define her entire existence: barren. So she'd packed her teaching certificates, her modest savings, and the few possessions that mattered, and she'd left. No tearful farewells, no promises to write. Just a brief note to her sister explaining that she'd accepted a position out west and would send an address once settled. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, dust billowing around the wheels. Through the window, Eleanor saw a hand-painted sign. Cimarron Station. Her destination. Her escape. Her new beginning, purchased with references and a train ticket. The driver's weathered face appeared at the window. "This is it, ma'am? You got someone meeting you?" "Yes." Eleanor smoothed her traveling dress, dark green wool that had seemed practical in Boston but felt absurdly formal now. "A Mr. Caleb Ross." "Ross?" The driver's expression shifted into something unreadable. "Well, he's a good man. Lost his wife 2 winters back. Those kids of his—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "You'll have your hands full." Eleanor's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice level. "I'm prepared for hard work." The driver helped her down, his grip steady on her elbow. Her boots hit packed earth, and immediately the scale of everything changed. Boston had been vertical, buildings stacked against each other, people layered in social strata. This was horizontal, the land spreading in all directions with nothing to interrupt the sight lines except mountains in the far distance and the occasional cottonwood marking a water source. The depot was little more than a covered platform with a small office attached. A few buildings clustered nearby, a mercantile, a saloon, what might have been a church. And standing beside a wagon with peeling paint and honest construction was a man who could only be Caleb Ross. He was tall, lean, in the way of men who worked from dawn until dark and forgot to eat. His shirt was clean but faded, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms bronzed by sun and scarred by labor. A hat shadowed his face, but Eleanor caught the impression of strong features, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a day or two, and eyes that assessed her with the same careful evaluation she imagined he'd give a horse he was considering purchasing. Behind him, partially hidden by the wagon, 3 children stood in descending order of height, like steps leading downward. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 12, had his father's build and a face closed tight as a fist. Beside him, a girl of maybe 9 watched Eleanor with undisguised suspicion, arms crossed over a patched dress. The youngest, a small girl who couldn't be more than 5, peeked around her sister's skirts with eyes too large for her thin face. Caleb Ross removed his hat, and Eleanor saw that his hair was dark with threads of premature gray at the temples. His eyes were gray too, the color of winter sky. "Miss Hale?" "Yes." She extended her hand, a gesture that felt ridiculous the moment she made it. But he took it, his palm calloused and warm, and shook once with surprising gentleness. "Caleb Ross. These are my children." He gestured without looking back. "Thomas, Sarah, and Lily." Eleanor smiled at them, though only the youngest returned it with a shy duck of her head. "I'm pleased to meet you all." Thomas said nothing. Sarah's expression suggested Eleanor had already failed some tests she hadn't known she was taking. "You had a good journey?" Caleb's tone was polite but distant, a man fulfilling social obligation without investment. "Long, but uneventful." Eleanor glanced at her trunk, which the driver was unloading with theatrical grunts. "I appreciate you meeting me." "Didn't have much choice." He moved to help with the trunk, lifting it as though it weighed nothing. "It's a 2-hour drive to the ranch. We should get moving if we want to make it before dark." The wagon was utilitarian, built for function rather than comfort. Caleb loaded her trunk in the back with efficiency, then helped her onto the bench seat. The children climbed into the wagon bed without being told, arranging themselves among sacks of flour and seed with the ease of long practice. As Caleb took up the reins, Eleanor caught him glancing at her dress, her gloves, her carefully pinned hair. She could practically hear his thoughts. City woman. Won't last a month. Well, she'd see about that. The wagon jolted forward, and Cimarron Station fell away behind them. The road, such as it was, cut through terrain that seemed determined to resist human passage. Sage and scrub gave way to rocky outcroppings, then back to stretches of grass that whispered in the constant wind. The sky was bigger than Eleanor had imagined sky could be, a dome of blue so intense it hurt to look at directly. "You said in your letter you taught school in Boston," Caleb said after a long silence. "Yes. Girls aged 6 through 14. Reading, arithmetic, history, some music." Eleanor kept her eyes on the horizon, afraid that looking at him would reveal too much of what she was running from. "I have my certificates, if you'd like to review them." "Saw them already. You wouldn't be here if they hadn't been in order." He guided the horses around a wash where recent rain had cut deep channels. "The children haven't had regular schooling since their mother passed. Thomas can read some. Sarah knows her letters. Lily's too young yet, but she's sharp." "I'll assess their current knowledge and develop appropriate lessons," Eleanor said, slipping into the professional tone that had always served her well. "How much time do you want devoted to education versus household duties?" Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Education matters, but so does keeping the house running. My wife—" He stopped, started again. "Things have gotten away from me. The children need structure, meals at regular times, someone to mend their clothes and make sure they wash behind their ears, someone to—" He trailed off, and Eleanor understood what he couldn't say. Someone to be what they lost. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll do my best." He glanced at her then, really looked at her, and Eleanor felt the weight of his evaluation. Whatever he saw made him nod once, sharply, before returning his attention to the road. Behind them, the children were silent. Eleanor wanted to turn, to engage them in conversation, to begin building whatever relationship would sustain them all through the coming months. But something in their stillness warned her off. They were watching her, she knew, waiting to see what kind of woman their father had brought home. The sun was lowering when the ranch finally came into view. It sat in a shallow valley with hills rising behind it, positioned to catch the morning light. The house was adobe, single-story, with a deep porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn that had seen better days, a chicken coop, a structure that might have been a smokehouse. A windmill turned lazily, its rhythmic creak carrying across the yard. It was, Eleanor thought with a strange lurch of her heart, both more and less than more real, less forgiving. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop near the house. Thomas, help me with the trunk. Sarah, show Miss Hale to her room. Lily, go gather eggs for supper. The children moved with practiced efficiency, each knowing their role without question. Sarah hopped down from the wagon with more grace than her dress and bare feet suggested she should possess. This way. The girl's voice was flat, offering nothing. She led Eleanor up the porch steps, which creaked under their weight, and through a door that stuck slightly in its frame. The interior was dim, shutters closed against the afternoon heat. As Eleanor's eyes adjusted, she took in a large main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space combined. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A table that had been built by hand rather than purchased sat surrounded by mismatched chairs. Shelves held dishes and supplies in no particular order. Everything was clean enough, but there was a quality of abandonment to it all, as though the house was waiting for someone to remember it was supposed to be a home. Your room's back here. Sarah moved through the space without hesitation, navigating around furniture to a hallway that led to the rear of the house. She pushed open a door to reveal a small bedroom with whitewashed walls, a narrow bed covered in a faded quilt, a washstand, and a trunk at the foot of the bed that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. This was... Sarah started, then stopped. You can put your things here. Thank you, Sarah. Eleanor set down the small bag she'd carried with her. It's a lovely room. The girl's expression suggested she knew a polite lie when she heard one. Supper's at 6. You're expected to cook it. She turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. If you can't cook, you should say so now. Pa doesn't like surprises. I can cook? Eleanor kept her voice gentle despite the challenge in Sarah's tone. Is there anything the family particularly likes? We eat what we have. Sarah's eyes were hard, protective. And we don't need anyone trying to replace our mother, no matter what Pa thinks. She left before Eleanor could respond, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Alone in the small room, Eleanor sank onto the bed and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. What have I done? The quilt beneath her hands was beautiful despite its age. A double wedding ring pattern in blues and creams stitched with the kind of care that spoke of love and patience. Eleanor traced one of the interlocking circles with her finger, wondering whose hands had made it, whose bed it had graced before ending up on a spare room cot. Through the window, she could hear Caleb and Thomas moving her trunk, the thud of it hitting the porch, the scrape of wood on wood as they maneuvered it through the door. Male voices in brief consultation. Then Caleb's boots in the hallway, stopping outside her room. Miss Hale? A knock accompanied the question. Your trunk's here. I'll leave it in the hall unless you need help moving it. Eleanor opened the door. Caleb stood with his hat in his hands, looking distinctly uncomfortable to be standing outside a woman's bedroom. The hall is fine. Thank you. He nodded, already turning away. Kitchen's stocked. You'll find what you need for supper. The children eat simple food, nothing fancy. There's a water pump by the back door and a root cellar under the porch if you need vegetables. Mr. Ross? Eleanor stepped into the hallway, struck by sudden need to establish something. Understanding, boundaries, expectations, before this arrangement calcified into patterns that couldn't be changed. I want to be clear about my position here. You advertised for household management and teaching. Those are services I can provide competently, but I am not... She searched for the right words. I cannot be their mother. I hope you understand that. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a flash of what might have been pain or anger before his face settled back into careful neutrality. Miss Hale, I don't expect you to replace Anna. No one could. What I expect is for you to keep this house running, teach my children their letters and numbers, and treat them with basic kindness. If you can do those things, we'll get along fine. I can do those things. Good. He settled his hat back on his head. Supper at 6. We eat together at the table. The children say grace. After the meal, Thomas has evening chores in the barn. Sarah helps with dishes, and Lily goes to bed. You'll find the routine suits everyone better if you keep to it. He left her then, his boots echoing through the house and out the front door. Eleanor stood in the hallway, surrounded by walls that belonged to someone else's life, and tried to remember why she'd thought running away would be simpler than staying put. The kitchen revealed itself in layers as Eleanor explored. Flour and cornmeal in covered crocks, salt pork hanging in the pantry, potatoes and onions in the root cellar, along with preserved vegetables in mason jars. A cast iron stove that looked well maintained despite its age. Implements hung from hooks, ladles, spatulas, knives that had been sharpened so many times the blades were thin as secrets. Someone had loved this kitchen once. Someone had known where everything belonged and why. Eleanor could feel that presence in the organization of the space, even as she noted the small signs of recent neglect. Dust on the highest shelves, a water stain by the pump that suggested a leak left unattended, spices that had lost their potency through time and disuse. She lit the stove, grateful for the familiarity of the task. Built a fire the way her mother had taught her, using kindling and patience. Set water to boil for potatoes. Found a knife and cutting board and began peeling vegetables with methodical precision, letting the rhythm of the work settle her scattered thoughts. Through the window above the washstand, she could see Caleb and Thomas working together near the barn. The boy moved like his father, economical gestures, no wasted motion. They were mending fence, she realized, replacing a post that had rotted through. Thomas held the new post steady while Caleb tamped earth around its base. Their collaboration so practiced, they barely needed to speak. Sarah appeared in this kitchen doorway so silently, Eleanor jumped. "You're making dinner." It wasn't quite a question. Eleanor wiped her hands on a towel that needed washing. "Yes, I thought fried potatoes and salt pork with onions. There are green beans in the cellar I can heat as well. Will that be acceptable?" "It's what Ma used to make." Sarah moved to the dish shelves, began setting the table without being asked. 4 plates, 4 cups, 4 sets of utensils. She laid them out with care, making sure the spacing was even. She'd make biscuits too, on good days, with butter and honey. "I can make biscuits," Eleanor offered. "Would you like me to?" Sarah's hand stilled over the last fork. For a moment, Eleanor thought she'd made a terrible mistake, presumed too much. Then the girl nodded, once, barely perceptible. "Lily likes them." It was, Eleanor understood, as much approval as she was going to get. She found flour and lard, salt, and the last precious scraping of baking powder. Mixed dough with her hands, feeling it come together under her palms. Rolled it out on a board dusted with flour and cut circles with the rim of a cup, the way her own mother had taught her years ago in a kitchen that smelled like wood smoke and yeast. Lily wandered in as Eleanor was sliding the biscuits into the oven. The little girl carried a basket with 3 brown eggs cradled in straw. She set it on the counter with the solemnity of someone presenting treasure. "Good work," Eleanor said softly. "That's exactly what we need for breakfast tomorrow." Lily stared at her with those enormous eyes, then smiled, quick and bright as a spark before ducking behind her sister. "She doesn't talk much," Sarah said, defensive. "Not since Ma died." "That's all right." Eleanor checked the potatoes, judged them nearly done. "We all grieve in our own way." Sarah's expression suggested that Eleanor had no right to speak about their grief, but she said nothing. Just moved around the kitchen with possessive familiarity, retrieving items Eleanor hadn't known she'd need. A platter for the pork, a bowl for the beans, the honey jar with its sticky lid. At precisely 6 o'clock, Caleb and Thomas came in from outside, bringing with them the smell of hay and honest sweat. They washed at the pump by the back door, Caleb helping Thomas reach the soap. When they settled at the table, Eleanor placed the food in the center, nothing fancy but hot and plentiful. The family joined hands automatically. Thomas on Caleb's right, Sarah on his left, Lily beside her sister. Eleanor stood uncertainly by the stove until Caleb gestured to the empty chair beside Thomas. "We're waiting on you, Miss Hale." She sat quickly, taking Thomas's hand and Sarah's. The boy's palm was calloused already, building toward the hands his father had. Sarah's grip was reluctant but firm. Caleb bowed his head. "Thomas." The boy's voice was quiet but steady. "For this food and those who prepared it, we give thanks. Amen." "Amen," the girls echoed, hands released. Food was passed without conversation, plates filled in order of age. Caleb served himself last, his portions modest despite the work Eleanor had watched him do. They ate in silence, broken only by the scrape of forks on plates and Lily's small pleased sound when she bit into a buttered biscuit. "These are good," Caleb said finally, nodding at the biscuits. Thank you. You're welcome. Eleanor helped Lily cut her pork into manageable pieces, an automatic gesture that made Sarah's fork pause halfway to her mouth. Thomas, how's the fence coming? Caleb's question was clearly part of a routine. Good, Pa. Should have the north pasture finished tomorrow if the weather holds. Good boy. Caleb's pride was quiet, but unmistakable. Sarah, did you finish your chores? Yes, Pa. Laundry's on the line. Chickens are fed. And Lily gathered eggs all by herself, Sarah added, putting her arm around her little sister. Didn't miss a single nest. Lily beamed and held up 3 fingers. The meal continued in this way. Small updates, quiet acknowledgments, a rhythm that had clearly been established long before Eleanor arrived. She was an intruder in it, she realized. An instrument that played the wrong notes no matter how carefully she tried to match the tune. After supper, Sarah and Eleanor cleared the table in silence while Thomas headed to the barn and Caleb settled into a chair by the fireplace with a piece of harness that needed mending. Lily shadowed her sister, carrying each plate to the wash basin with concentration that furrowed her small brow. I can finish this, Sarah said when the last dish was washed. You can, she gestured vaguely at nothing. Do whatever you need to do. Eleanor dried her hands on her skirt. Actually, I thought I might assess your reading levels before bed, if that's all right with your father. Sarah's expression closed. I can read fine. I'm sure you can, but I need to understand where each of you is so I can plan appropriate lessons. Eleanor kept her voice matter-of-fact. Teacher rather than interloper. Just a few minutes. Pa? Sarah turned to Caleb for permission or rescue. Caleb looked up from his work. Won't hurt anything. Get your brother when you're done here. So Eleanor found herself in the main room with 3 children arranged on the bench by the fireplace and Caleb as audience whether she wanted one or not. She'd retrieved a book from her trunk, a reader she'd used in Boston, stories chosen for moral instruction and vocabulary building. Thomas read haltingly but competently, stumbling over unfamiliar words but understanding context. Sarah read better than she wanted Eleanor to know, her fluency betrayed by the way her eyes raced ahead of her voice. Lily just listened, curled against her sister, thumb in her mouth. You've done well teaching them, Eleanor said to Caleb when the children were dismissed to prepare for bed. Thomas especially has a good foundation. Anna started them young. Caleb's voice was neutral, but his hand stilled on the leather he was working. She believed education mattered, even out here, maybe especially out here. She was right. Eleanor hesitated, then continued. I'll work with them each morning after breakfast. Reading, writing, arithmetic. 2 hours should be sufficient without overwhelming them. Fine. He resumed his stitching, neat small movements that spoke of practice. Miss Hale, I want to be clear about something. I brought you here because my children need stability. They need someone to teach them and keep the house running while I manage the ranch. That's the arrangement. Nothing more complicated than that. I understand. Eleanor stood, suddenly exhausted by the weight of the day. I'll say good night then. She was halfway down the hall when his voice stopped her. Miss Hale. Yes? Thank you for the biscuits, for... He gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the table where his family had eaten together with something approaching normalcy for the first time in months. For being here. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice, and retreated to her small room with its faded quilt and whitewashed walls. She unpacked her trunk in the lamplight, hanging her few dresses on pegs, arranging her books on the floor since there was no shelf. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in tissue paper, she found the handkerchief her sister had embroidered for her, white linen with blue forget-me-nots in one corner. Don't forget who you are, her sister had written in the accompanying note. Don't let them make you into someone smaller. Eleanor pressed the handkerchief to her face, breathing in the faint scent of the lavender sachet it had been stored with. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into her pillowcase, a secret softness in a hard place. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the household settling, water splashing as children washed, Sarah's voice, low and patient, helping Lily with buttons, Thomas's heavier tread heading to whatever room he claimed. Caleb's footsteps moving through the house one final time, checking locks, banking the fire, performing the rituals of security that fathers performed. Eleanor extinguished her lamp, and lay in the darkness, listening to the absolute silence of the New Mexico night. No carriages, no street vendors, no neighbor's piano, just wind and the distant cry of something wild and the creak of a house that was learning to hold her weight. She'd come here to disappear, to escape the suffocating pity of people who measured her worth by her womb. But lying here in Anna Ross's spare room, wearing Anna Ross's quilts, cooking in Anna Ross's kitchen for Anna Ross's children, Eleanor wondered if she'd simply traded one impossible expectation for another. She'd told Caleb she couldn't be their mother. She'd meant it. She still meant it. But as sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's last conscious thought was of Lily's small smile over a buttered biscuit, and Sarah's reluctant trust in allowing her to read to them, and Thomas's careful handshake when he'd bid her goodnight. I cannot be their mother, she thought. I won't survive if I try to be something I'm not. The darkness had no answer. But somewhere in the house, a child coughed once, then settled, and Eleanor found herself listening, alert, concerned, already learning the sounds that meant safety versus the ones that meant intervention. Already, without meaning to, beginning to care. The morning arrived with violence, a rooster's crow that shattered Eleanor's sleep like glass breaking. She jolted upright in the unfamiliar bed, heart hammering, momentarily lost in the disorientation of waking in a place her body didn't yet recognize as safe. Gray light filtered through the single window, and somewhere in the house she could hear movement. Boots on wooden floors, the clank of the stove being opened. She dressed quickly in the dawn chill, her fingers clumsy with buttons. The dress she chose was practical calico, brown with tiny white flowers. Something that wouldn't show every speck of dust and dirt this territory seemed determined to coat everything with. She braided her hair with efficient movements, pinned it close to her head, and splashed water from the basin on her face. The water was cold enough to make her gasp. When she emerged from her room, Caleb was already at the stove, feeding wood into its iron belly. He glanced up at her entrance, taking in her appearance with that same assessing look from yesterday. "Morning, Miss Hale. Coffee's on." "Thank you." Eleanor moved to the counter where a battered pot sat steaming. She poured herself a cup, black and strong enough to strip paint. "What time do the children wake?" "Sunup, usually. Thomas will be down soon. He's got animals to tend before breakfast. The girls sleep later if we let them." Caleb pulled a skillet from a hook on the wall. "I usually make breakfast, eggs and whatever else is handy, but if you're taking over the cooking—" "I am." Eleanor set down her coffee and took the skillet from him. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and both pulled back as if burned. "Please, you have your work. I have mine." He nodded and retreated to the table with his coffee, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Eleanor tried to ignore his scrutiny as she went about the business of making breakfast, cracking eggs into a bowl, slicing the salt pork thin, setting bread to toast on the stovetop. She moved through Anna's kitchen like a stranger in a foreign country, searching for familiar landmarks. "Mixing bowls to your left," Caleb said quietly. "Spatulas hanging behind you." "Thank you." Eleanor found the items, incorporated them into her work. The silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable but not hostile either, just two people learning to occupy the same space. Thomas appeared as the eggs were beginning to set, his hair wet from washing, his shirt buttoned wrong. He fixed it without being told, then headed outside to complete whatever chores couldn't wait for daylight. Through the window, Eleanor watched him move toward the barn with his father's purposeful stride, and something in her chest constricted. 12 years old and already carrying the weight of being the man his father needed him to become. Sarah emerged next, Lily's hand clasped in hers. The older girl had braided her sister's hair, though it was crooked and already beginning to unravel. Lily's dress was inside out, the seams showing, but Sarah's face dared Eleanor to comment. "Good morning, girls." Eleanor kept her tone light. "Lily, would you like me to help you turn your dress right?" Lily looked down at herself, then up at Sarah with worried eyes. "She's fine," Sarah said flatly. "She dressed herself." "I can see that." Eleanor crouched down to Lily's level, making herself smaller, less threatening. "You did a good job with the buttons. Those are tricky. But see how the seams are showing? That means it's inside out. Would you like to learn how to tell which way is right?" Lily hesitated, then nodded. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she said nothing as Eleanor gently helped the little girl out of her dress, showed her the difference between the inside stitches. The whole process took less than a minute, but when it was done, Lily smoothed her hands down the front of her dress with visible satisfaction. There. Perfect. Eleanor stood, meeting Sarah's hostile gaze with calm neutrality. Breakfast is almost ready. Would you help me set the table? It was the same dance as last night. Sarah moving through tasks with possessive familiarity, Eleanor trying to find her place without displacing anyone. They laid out plates and cups, poured coffee and milk, arranged the food on serving platters. By the time Thomas and Caleb returned from the barn, breakfast was waiting. The meal followed the same pattern as supper, grace spoken by Thomas. Food passed in careful order, eating accomplished with more efficiency than conversation. But Eleanor noticed things this time. The way Caleb made sure each child had enough before serving himself, how Sarah automatically cut Lily's food without being asked, the subtle nod Thomas gave his father when asked about the livestock. "Miss Hale," Caleb said as he pushed back his plate, "after dishes, I'd like you to look at the pantry. Make a list of what we need from town. I'll be going in on Saturday. You can ride along if there's anything you need to select yourself." "That would be helpful. Thank you." Eleanor began gathering plates, aware of Sarah watching her every move. "When would you like me to begin lessons with the children?" "After morning chores are finished? Say 9 o'clock? Caleb stood, retrieving his hat from its peg. "Thomas, you're with me today. We've got fence to finish. Sarah, you know what needs doing. Lily helps where she can." The family dispersed like water poured on hard ground, each to their appointed tasks. Eleanor was left in the kitchen with a sink full of dishes and the growing realization that she'd accepted a position she didn't fully understand. She wasn't just a teacher or a housekeeper. She was expected to be the axis around which this household turned, the force that kept chaos at bay and children fed and the countless small tasks of daily living accomplished without fail. She washed dishes with methodical precision, learning the chips and cracks in each plate, the bent tines of forks, the cups that leaked if filled too full. Through the window she could see Sarah hanging laundry on a line stretched between two posts, her movements sharp with barely contained emotion. Lily sat in the dirt nearby, singing softly to a doll made from corn husks and string. When the kitchen was clean, Eleanor moved to the pantry. It was larger than she'd expected, built into the north side of the house where it stayed coolest. Shelves lined 3 walls, holding supplies in various states of depletion. She found paper and a pencil stub and began making notes. Flour, running low, sugar, nearly gone. Coffee, baking powder, salt, all needed replenishing. The preserved vegetables would last, but they'd need fresh supplies come spring. Dried beans, rice, oats, lamp oil, soap. She was so absorbed in her inventory that she didn't hear Sarah approach until the girl spoke from the doorway. "Ma kept better records than that." Eleanor turned, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm sure she did. Would you show me her system?" Sarah blinked, clearly not expecting cooperation. She moved into the pantry, running her fingers along a shelf until she found a small ledger tucked behind the flour sack. She wrote everything down, what we used, what we bought, what we needed. Pa would look at it before going to town, so he knew exactly what to get. Eleanor took the ledger carefully, aware she was holding something precious. Anna Ross's handwriting was precise and elegant, each entry dated and detailed. More than just supplies, she'd noted prices, compared costs between the mercantile and the trading post, tracked seasonal availability. It was the work of someone who understood that survival on a ranch required planning and intelligence as much as physical labor. "This is excellent," Eleanor said quietly. "Would you help me update it? You know the household better than I do." For a moment, something flickered in Sarah's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the faintest beginning of respect. Then her walls came back up. "I've got laundry to finish." "Of course." Eleanor let her go, understanding that trust couldn't be demanded or rushed. She spent the next hour updating the ledger, cross-referencing Anna's notes with current supplies, building a comprehensive list for Saturday's trip to town. At 9 o'clock, she gathered the children at the table. Thomas came in from outside, smelling of hay and horse, his hands scrubbed, but his fingernails permanently outlined in dirt. Sarah positioned herself between Eleanor and Lily like a buffer. Lily clutched her corn husk doll and watched Eleanor with cautious curiosity. "We're going to start simply. Eleanor said, arranging the book she'd brought from Boston on the table. Thomas, I'd like you to continue reading where you left off last night. Sarah, you'll work on composition. I want you to write one page about anything you choose. Lily, you and I will work on letters. I can work with Lily, Sarah said immediately. I always help her. And you've done a wonderful job teaching her. Eleanor met the girl's defensive gaze with steady calm. But now I'm here to help too. You focus on your own work. Let me get to know your sister. Sarah's hand tightened on Lily's shoulder, but the little girl gently pulled away and climbed into the chair beside Eleanor. Betrayed, Sarah's expression said. Eleanor pretended not to notice. The lesson revealed what Eleanor had suspected. Thomas read adequately but lacked comprehension strategies. He could sound out words but didn't always understand what they meant. Sarah wrote with surprising sophistication, her sentences complex and her spelling mostly accurate. And Lily, silent Lily, knew more than anyone had realized. When Eleanor pointed to letters, the child identified them correctly. When Eleanor spelled simple words, Lily's eyes followed with clear understanding. Can you write your name? Eleanor asked softly, offering Lily the pencil. The little girl took it in her fist, tongue poking out in concentration. Slowly, carefully, she formed the letters. L-I-L-Y. Crooked and uncertain, but unmistakably her name. Excellent, Eleanor breathed. Oh, Lily, that's beautiful. Lily's smile was like sunrise. Sarah's pencil had stopped moving, her eyes fixed on her sister with an expression of wonder and resentment combined. Thomas kept his head down, but Eleanor could see the tightness in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched. They worked for 2 hours. Eleanor rotated between them, offering guidance and encouragement, correcting errors without criticism, praising effort as much as achievement. When she finally dismissed them to their other tasks, Thomas fled immediately. Sarah lingered, collecting books with unnecessary care. She never wrote before, Sarah said finally, not looking at Eleanor. Ma tried to teach her, but after Ma died, she just stopped trying. Sometimes grief takes our words, Eleanor said gently, but they come back when we're ready. Lily's ready now. You think you fixed her in one morning? Sarah's voice was sharp with accusation. You think you can just show up and make everything better? No. Eleanor met the girl's anger with steady truth. I don't think I fixed anything. I think Lily has been healing in her own time, and today she was ready to show us how far she's come. That's not my doing, Sarah. That's hers, and probably yours, for loving her enough to be patient. Sarah's eyes welled with sudden tears that she blinked back furiously. Don't try to make me like you. I'm not trying to make you anything. Eleanor kept her voice level despite the ache in her chest. I'm just trying to be useful while I'm here, that's all. The girl fled then, leaving Eleanor alone with the books and the morning light slanting through windows that needed washing. She sat for a moment in the silence, feeling the weight of what she'd undertaken settle more firmly on her shoulders. These children weren't just students to be taught. They were wounds walking, grief given shape and breath, loss wearing familiar faces. And she'd promised she wouldn't try to be their mother. The days developed a rhythm after that first morning. Eleanor rose before dawn, started the fire, made coffee. Caleb appeared like a ghost, taking his cup and heading outside with Thomas in tow. The girls woke later, Sarah defensive and Lily increasingly bold in her attachment to Eleanor. Breakfast, chores, lessons, dinner prepared while children completed afternoon tasks. Supper together at the table, grace and food, and the small exchanges that constituted family conversation. Evening quiet, books read by lamplight, children put to bed, Caleb working on endless repairs while Eleanor mended clothes or updated Anna's meticulous household ledgers. It was exhausting and repetitive, and nothing like Eleanor's life in Boston had been. It was also, she realized with some surprise, deeply satisfying in ways she hadn't anticipated. There was clarity in the work. Tasks that had visible results, efforts that mattered in immediate and concrete ways. A meal cooked was a meal eaten. A lesson taught was knowledge gained. A sock mended meant warm feet when winter came. On Saturday, she rode into town beside Caleb, the wagon bed loaded with goods to sell, and the list of supplies they needed to buy. The road was rough, the journey long, But Eleanor found herself grateful for the excuse to see more of the territory that was now her home. Cimarron had grown slightly in the week since she'd arrived, or perhaps she was simply seeing it with clearer eyes. The mercantile was crowded with ranchers and their families, all stocking up for the coming weeks. Caleb introduced her with economic words. "This is Miss Hale. She's helping with the children and the house." That clearly satisfied no one's curiosity. The stares were immediate and assessing. Women's eyes traveling from Eleanor's practical dress to her bare ring finger to the wagon outside where Caleb Ross waited. She could practically hear the calculations, the judgments forming behind polite smiles. How nice that Caleb found someone, a woman in an elaborate hat said, her tone suggesting it was anything but nice. "Those poor children have been without a mother's care for so long." "I'm their teacher and housekeeper," Eleanor said firmly. "Nothing more." "Of course." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Still, it must be difficult, living out there alone with a man, no matter how respectable the arrangement." Eleanor felt her face flush, but kept her voice steady. "Mr. Ross has been nothing but professional and courteous. His children are my priority." She completed her purchases quickly after that, aware of whispers following her between the shelves. The fabric she selected was practical cotton for children's clothes. The lamp oil, the soap, the spices, all chosen with Anna's ledger as guide. She added one extravagance, a small slate and chalk for Lily, who was progressing so quickly with her letters. Caleb was waiting by the wagon, loading sacks of feed. He took one look at Eleanor's face and frowned. "Trouble?" "Just talk." She helped him load her purchases, grateful for the physical work. "Nothing I can't handle. People like to speculate." His jaw tightened, especially about a widower and a single woman living under one roof. "I should have considered that before bringing you out here." "You were honest about the position. If people choose to see something else, that's their failure of imagination, not ours." Eleanor settled onto the wagon bench with more force than necessary. "I won't let gossip drive me away from work that needs doing." Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. But Miss Hale, you should know. If the talk gets worse, if it affects you or the children, we'll need to discuss options." "What options?" Eleanor's stomach tightened. "Marriage." The word dropped between them like a stone into still water. "Legal and proper for appearances. Nothing would need to change between us personally, but it would stop the whispers and protect everyone's reputation." Eleanor stared at him, unable to form words. Marriage. To this silent man she barely knew. For appearances. For protection. For... "Think about it," Caleb said, taking up the reins. "No pressure. But if it comes to that, the offer stands." They rode back to the ranch in silence, each lost in thoughts too complicated to share. Eleanor's mind spun with possibilities and consequences. A marriage of convenience would solve the social problem, yes, but it would also trap her in a role she'd spent 300 miles running from. Wife, mother, woman defined by her relationship to others rather than her own merits. And yet, a marriage license would give her legitimacy in the children's lives, would let her make decisions about their education and welfare without constantly deferring to Caleb, would ensure she couldn't simply be dismissed if he decided he no longer needed her services. Security. That's what he was offering, the very thing she'd come west to find. "I'll think about it," she said as they pulled into the ranch yard. "But I need time." "Take what you need." Caleb helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady on her elbow. "Like I said, no pressure." But there was pressure, Eleanor thought, as she watched him drive the wagon toward the barn. Pressure from the town's judgment, from the children's needs, from the simple mathematics of survival in a place where a woman alone had few good options. She'd run from Boston to escape being defined by what she couldn't give a husband. Now she was being offered marriage explicitly because it would give her and the children protection without requiring anything beyond practical partnership. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like another kind of trap. That night, as she prepared supper, Sarah appeared at her elbow. The girl had been quieter than usual all day, helping with chores without her typical defensive commentary. "Did something happen in town?" Sarah asked, peeling potatoes with vicious efficiency. "Pa seemed angry when you got back." "Not angry, concerned. Eleanor measured coffee into the pot, careful to meet Anna's exact proportions. There was some talk about me living here. What kind of talk? The unkind kind. Eleanor set the pot on the stove. People making assumptions about your father and me that aren't true. Sarah's hand stilled. Are you leaving? The naked fear in that question stopped Eleanor's heart. What? No, why would you think that? Because they always leave. Sarah's voice cracked. Ma left. Even though she didn't want to, she died and left us. The woman who came before you lasted 3 weeks before she decided it was too hard and went back east. Everyone leaves. Eleanor set down the spoon she'd been holding and turned to face Sarah fully. I'm not leaving. I made a commitment to your father and to you children. Some gossip isn't going to change that. But if people talk, let them talk. Eleanor heard the fierceness in her own voice and didn't try to temper it. I've been talked about before, Sarah. I survived it then, and I'll survive it now. This work matters more than what small minds think of me. Sarah's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Why? Why what? Why does it matter? Why do we matter? The girl's voice was raw with a child's desperate need to understand. You could teach anywhere, keep house for anyone. Why stay here with us? Eleanor opened her mouth to give the practical answer. The salary, the room and board, the escape from Boston. But looking at Sarah's tear-bright eyes and trembling chin, she found herself speaking a deeper truth. Because you're good students who deserve to learn. Because this house deserves to be a home again. Because your father is doing his best alone and shouldn't have to. Because Lily smiles now when she writes her name, and Thomas is starting to understand what he reads. And you... Eleanor reached out slowly, giving Sarah time to pull away. When the girl didn't, she gently touched her shoulder. You try so hard to take care of everyone, Sarah. You shouldn't have to do it all alone. The dam broke. Sarah crumpled against Eleanor's shoulder, sobbing with the kind of grief that had clearly been held back too long. Eleanor wrapped her arms around the shaking child, murmuring wordless comfort, while Sarah cried out months of fear and loss and exhaustion. I miss her, Sarah gasped between sobs. I miss her so much, and I don't want to forget her, but I don't remember what her voice sounded like anymore. And I'm so tired of being scared. I know, sweetheart. Eleanor held her tighter, this fierce girl who'd been trying so hard to be strong. You won't forget her. Love doesn't work that way, and you don't have to be scared anymore. I'm here. I'm not leaving. They stood like that until Sarah's sobs quieted to hiccups, until the girl pulled back with red eyes and blotchy cheeks and embarrassment starting to creep in. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered. I didn't mean to. Don't apologize for crying. Eleanor handed her a clean dish towel to wipe her face. Grief needs to come out sometimes. Otherwise it poisons everything from the inside. Sarah nodded, scrubbing at her eyes. When she lowered the towel, something fundamental had shifted in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of possibility. The first crack in the wall she'd built to protect herself. Can I help you finish supper? The question was tentative, offering rather than demanding. I'd like that very much. They worked side by side until the meal was ready, and if there was a new ease between them, neither commented on it directly. When Caleb and Thomas came in from evening chores, Sarah set the table without being asked and actually smiled when Eleanor thanked her. Lily noticed immediately, her eyes darting between her sister and Eleanor with pleased recognition. Whatever had happened, she seemed to understand that it was good. That night, after the children were in bed and Caleb was settled with his mending, Eleanor sat at the table with Anna's household ledger and tried to imagine what the woman who'd written these careful entries would think of her. Would Anna approve of Eleanor teaching her children? Would she be grateful or resentful? Would she want Eleanor to stay or leave? You're thinking loud enough to hear. Caleb's voice startled her. He'd set aside his leather work and was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Just wondering about Anna, Eleanor said honestly. What she'd think of all this. Caleb was quiet for so long Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, she'd be grateful. Anna believed children needed education and stability above everything else. She'd want them cared for by someone competent and kind. He paused. She'd like you, Miss Hale. You're more similar than you might think. How so? She came out here from Philadelphia, city woman trying to make a life in hard country. People told her she wouldn't last. She proved them all wrong. His voice softened with memory. She was stubborn and smart, and she loved those children more than her own life, which is why she kept working when she should have been resting, why she insisted on helping with harvest when she was already sick, why she... He stopped, jaw clenched against words he couldn't say. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said quietly, "for your loss. For theirs. It was influenza. Swept through here 2 winters ago. Children got it too, but pulled through. Anna didn't. She fought so hard, but..." He shook his head. "Afterward, I tried to keep things going the way she would have wanted. But I'm a rancher, not a teacher, not a mother. The children were drowning, and I didn't know how to save them. You saved them by recognizing what they needed and finding a way to provide it." Eleanor met his eyes across the lamplight. "That's not failure, Mr. Ross. That's love." He studied her for a long moment. "About what I said earlier, the marriage proposal. I meant it, not as pressure, but as protection, for you as much as the children. If the talk gets worse, I'll consider it." Eleanor closed the ledger carefully. "But I want to be clear about something. If I agree, it would be for practical reasons only. I won't pretend to be something I'm not, and I can't." She struggled to find words for the fear that had driven her across a continent. "I'm not asking you to be Anna." Caleb's voice was firm. "I'm not looking for romance or replacement, just partnership. Someone to help me raise these children and keep this ranch running. Someone I can trust to stay when things get hard. Can you be that?" Could she? Eleanor looked around the kitchen that was becoming familiar, thought of Sarah's breakthrough tonight, of Lily's growing confidence, of Thomas's slow smile when he finally understood a passage he'd been struggling with. Thought of work that mattered, and a place that needed her, and a life built on honesty rather than pretense. "Yes," she said quietly. "I can be that." Caleb nodded once, satisfied. "Then we'll see how things go. If the gossip dies down, no need for drastic measures. If it doesn't..." He left the possibility hanging between them. Eleanor excused herself and retreated to her room, where she sat on the edge of the bed with her sister's embroidered handkerchief pressed to her face. "Don't forget who you are," the note had said. But who was she exactly? The broken woman who'd fled Boston, or the capable one who was building something here in New Mexico? The teacher who insisted she couldn't be a mother, or the woman who'd held Sarah while she cried? Through the thin walls, she could hear the house settling into sleep. Caleb's boots as he made his final rounds, the soft murmur of Sarah talking to Lily in their shared room. Thomas coughing once, then silence. A family. Not hers, but under her care nonetheless. And the truth Eleanor was beginning to understand was that care, repeated daily with patience and commitment, might transform into something that looked an awful lot like love, whether she planned for it or not. She was still afraid, still certain she would fail them somehow, prove inadequate to the role they needed her to fill. But as she finally extinguished her lamp and lay down to sleep, Eleanor found herself thinking not about escape, but about staying. About breakfast tomorrow and lessons, and the 1,000 small tasks that would weave her more tightly into the fabric of this household. About what it might mean to choose belonging instead of running. Outside, an owl called through the darkness. The wind whispered against the adobe walls. And Eleanor Hale, city woman and reluctant pioneer, closed her eyes and imagined what it might feel like to finally come home. The owl's call faded into morning bird song before Eleanor fully registered that she'd slept through the night without waking. No nightmares of Boston parlors and pitying looks. No anxious hours counting the ways she might fail. Just deep, dreamless sleep that left her rested in a way she hadn't been in months. She dressed quickly and emerged to find Caleb already at the stove, but this time he stepped aside when she entered, handing her the coffee pot without a word. A small gesture, but it spoke of acceptance. This was her domain now, and he was acknowledging it. The week that followed felt like crossing an invisible threshold. Sarah began sitting closer during lessons, sometimes offering observations about what Lily was learning or asking Eleanor questions about grammar that went beyond the assignments. Thomas started staying after his reading session to ask about words he'd encountered in the almanac Caleb kept by his chair. And Lily, sweet, silent Lily, began following Eleanor around the house like a devoted shadow, her corn-husk doll tucked under one arm and her slate under the other. "You're doing well with them," Caleb said one evening as they worked side by side in the kitchen, him cleaning his rifle while Eleanor kneaded dough for tomorrow's bread. Sarah smiled at supper. Actually smiled. I haven't seen that in months. She's a remarkable girl. Eleanor pressed her palms into the dough, feeling it yield and spring back. Carrying too much weight for someone her age, but remarkable. Like someone else I know. Caleb's tone was dry, but there was warmth underneath it. "You work harder than anyone I've ever hired, Miss Hale. The house hasn't run this smoothly since Anna was alive." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm just doing what was agreed upon." "You're doing more than that, and we both know it." He set the rifle aside, wiped his hands on a rag. "Which is why I need to tell you something. There's going to be an inquiry." The dough slipped from Eleanor's suddenly nerveless fingers. "What kind of inquiry?" "Territorial Children's Welfare Board. Someone in town must have written them, expressing concern about the children's living situation." Caleb's voice was carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. "They're sending a representative next week to assess whether the household is appropriate." "Because of me." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Because I'm unmarried and living here." "Most likely." Caleb met her eyes steadily. "Which brings us back to that conversation we had. If we were married, there'd be no question of impropriety. No grounds for removing the children from their home." "Removing them?" Eleanor's hands were shaking now. "They'd actually take them away from you?" "They have that authority if they determine the situation is unsuitable." Caleb's jaw clenched, and a single man with a live-in woman who's not his wife, no matter how proper the arrangement actually is, could be deemed unsuitable, especially with someone in town making formal complaints. Eleanor sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unreliable. "When is this inquiry?" "Thursday, 4 days from now." Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. "Miss Hale, Eleanor, I know this isn't what you wanted. I know you came here to escape this exact kind of pressure, but those children have already lost one mother. If they lose this home too, if they get separated and sent to different families or an orphanage..." His voice broke slightly. "I can't let that happen." Eleanor looked at her hands, still dusty with flour, and thought about Sarah's breakthrough tears, about Lily writing her name with such fierce concentration, about Thomas asking what perseverance meant after reading it in a story. She thought about breakfast together at the table and lessons by lamplight, and the way this house was slowly becoming something that felt like home. What would the marriage entail? Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Legally, I mean. We'd need to go to town tomorrow, file the papers with the justice of the peace. He could perform the ceremony right there. Takes about 5 minutes. We'd sign the certificate, bring it home, and when the inquiry happens on Thursday, you'd be my legal wife." Caleb's expression was serious but not unkind. "Everything else stays the same. Separate rooms, same working arrangement, just with a piece of paper that protects everyone. And if I say no? Then I respect your choice, and we face whatever comes on Thursday without it." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his palm. "I won't force this, Eleanor. You've already given up enough of yourself to come here. I won't ask you to sacrifice more unless you're willing." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her like physical force. Everything in her that had fled Boston screamed to refuse, to maintain the independence she'd fought so hard to claim. But there was another voice now, quieter, but growing stronger, that spoke of different kinds of freedom. The freedom to choose what mattered. The freedom to protect what she was building here. "If we do this," she said slowly, opening her eyes to meet his, "I need your word on something. This is legal partnership only. I won't share your bed, I won't pretend to be in love, and I won't tolerate anyone, including you, expecting me to be Anna's replacement in any way except the practical ones we've already established." "You have my word." Caleb's voice was solemn as an oath. "I'm not looking for romance, Eleanor. I'm looking for someone I can trust to help me raise my children and keep this household running. You've already proven you're that person. The marriage license is just making it official, so no government busybody can tear apart what we're building." Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling herself step off an edge she couldn't see the bottom of. Then yes, we'll go to town tomorrow and do what needs to be done. Relief flooded Caleb's face so suddenly it was almost painful to witness. Thank you. I know it's asking a lot. We're asking it of each other. Eleanor stood, returning to her abandoned dough with hands that were almost steady now. For the children's sake, that's what matters. That night, Eleanor lay awake long after the house fell silent, staring at the ceiling and trying to comprehend what she'd agreed to. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Caleb Ross, wife to a man she barely knew, stepmother to 3 children who weren't hers, partner in a life she was still learning to navigate. It should have terrified her. Instead, there was an odd sense of inevitability to it, as if she'd been moving toward this moment since the instant she'd stepped off that stagecoach into New Mexico dust. Morning came too quickly. Caleb had arranged for a neighbor woman to watch the children, Mrs. Chen, a Chinese immigrant whose own ranch bordered theirs to the east. She arrived just after breakfast, a tiny woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "So you're marrying the teacher?" she said to Caleb in accented but perfect English. "About time you made an honest woman of her before the town talked her reputation to shreds." "It's not like that," Caleb started, but Mrs. Chen waved him off. "Doesn't matter what it's like, matters what it looks like." She turned to Eleanor with a gaze that seemed to see straight through to bone. "You're doing right by these children. That's what matters. The rest is just paperwork and social nonsense." Eleanor found herself smiling despite her nerves. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen." "Call me May. We're neighbors now. Well, we will be once you're legally his wife." May shooed them toward the door. "Go on. Children will be fine with me. I brought almond cookies and I know all the best stories. They won't even notice you're gone." The ride to town was quiet, both of them absorbed in private thoughts. Eleanor wore her best dress, dark blue wool with a simple white collar. Caleb had shaved and put on a clean shirt, though he'd drawn the line at a tie. They looked, Eleanor thought, exactly like what they were, 2 practical people attending to necessary business. Cimarron was busier than Eleanor had seen it, Saturday bringing ranchers and miners in from the surrounding territory. They drew stairs as they walked to the small building that served as both courthouse and land office. Eleanor could feel the weight of judgment, speculation, satisfaction from those who'd predicted exactly this outcome. The justice of the peace was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. He looked up from his paperwork as they entered, recognition dawning immediately. "Mr. Ross, Miss Hale." His tone suggested he'd been expecting them. "What can I do for you today?" "We need to file a marriage certificate," Caleb said bluntly. "And if you can perform the ceremony now, that would be appreciated." The justice's eyebrows rose, but he was already reaching for the appropriate forms. "I'll need witnesses. 2 of them." Caleb glanced around the small office, clearly not having considered this requirement. Eleanor felt panic beginning to flutter in her chest. They couldn't do this without witnesses, but who in this town would stand up for them? "I'll witness." They both turned to find May Chen in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest. "Followed you. Figured you 2 practical fools wouldn't think about witnesses." She looked past them to the justice. "One more needed?" "I'll stand." The voice came from behind May and a man stepped forward, tall, weathered, with a badge pinned to his vest. The sheriff, Eleanor realized. "Name's Tom Garrett. Known Caleb since he first settled here. If he says this is right, that's good enough for me." The ceremony took exactly as long as Caleb had predicted. 5 minutes of legal language, promises made without poetry, rings that didn't exist. Eleanor repeated words that felt both momentous and mundane, binding herself to a man whose favorite coffee strength she knew better than his middle name. When the justice pronounced them married, Caleb shook her hand with the same careful gentleness he'd shown that first day at the depot. "Thank you," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "We're protecting the children," Eleanor replied, which wasn't exactly an answer but was all the truth she could manage. They signed the certificate with May and Sheriff Garrett as witnesses. The justice stamped it with official finality and handed Caleb the document that would prove to any inquiry board that his household was perfectly respectable. "Congratulations," the justice said dryly. "May your marriage be as sensible as this ceremony." Outside, May pressed a small package into Eleanor's hands. Wedding gift. Jasmine tea, very good quality. You look like you could use something calming. Thank you, May. Eleanor clutched the package like a lifeline. For everything. You're welcome. Now go home to those children and stop looking so terrified. You just got married, not sentenced to death. May patted Eleanor's arm with surprising gentleness. Though sometimes it feels like same thing, eh? But you picked a good man, even if you picked him for practical reasons. Could do worse. Sheriff Garrett tipped his hat to them both. Ma'am, Caleb, I'll make sure Judge Preston knows about this before the inquiry. Might smooth things over some. The ride home was different from the ride in, weighted with the reality of what they'd done. Eleanor kept glancing at the certificate folded in Caleb's pocket, tangible proof of promises made and futures altered. You all right? Caleb asked as they turned onto the ranch road. I'm not sure, Eleanor admitted. Ask me again when the inquiry is over and the children are safe. Fair enough. He was quiet for a moment, then added, For what it's worth, I meant what I said before. Nothing has to change between us. You're still Eleanor, I'm still Caleb, and we're still just trying to give those kids a decent life. But everything had changed, Eleanor thought. She was a wife now, even if only on paper, Mrs. Ross instead of Miss Hale, legally bound to this man in this place in ways that made her previous commitments seem flimsy by comparison. The children were playing in the yard when they arrived, Lily chasing a ball while Sarah and Thomas helped May hang laundry. All three looked up at the wagon's approach, and Eleanor saw the question in their eyes even before Sarah voiced it. Where did you go? Caleb climbed down from the wagon, then helped Eleanor down with a hand on her elbow that felt different now, weighted with new significance. He cleared his throat, suddenly looking more uncomfortable than Eleanor had ever seen him. We went to town to take care of some business, legal business. He pulled the certificate from his pocket, unfolded it with careful hands. Miss Hale and I got married this morning. The silence was absolute. Thomas's jaw dropped open. Sarah's face went white. Lily looked between them with confused eyes, too young to fully understand, but sensing the enormity regardless. Married? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. You married her? Yes. Caleb knelt down so he was at eye level with his daughter. There's going to be an inquiry on Thursday. People from the territorial government coming to make sure you children are being properly cared for. If Miss Hale, if Eleanor and I weren't married, they might decide our household wasn't appropriate. They might try to separate you. Because of the talk in town. Sarah's eyes were bright with sudden understanding and anger. Because people said bad things about her living here. Yes. Caleb didn't try to soften it. This way, there's nothing improper about the household. Eleanor is legally my wife, which makes her legally your stepmother. The inquiry board will have no grounds to separate our family. Is that what we are now? Thomas's voice cracked slightly. A family? Caleb looked at Eleanor, and she saw the question in his eyes too. They'd done this for protection, for legality, for practical reasons that had nothing to do with emotion. But standing here in the yard with 3 children watching and waiting, Eleanor understood that the answer mattered more than any certificate. Yes, she said firmly, stepping forward to stand beside Caleb. We're a family. Maybe not a traditional one, maybe not the one any of us planned for. But we take care of each other, we work together, and we don't let anyone tear us apart. That's what families do. Lily was the first to move. She ran straight to Eleanor and wrapped her small arms around Eleanor's waist with fierce possession. Mama, she whispered, the first word Eleanor had heard her speak beyond the occasional whispered yes or no. My mama, now. Eleanor's throat closed with sudden emotion. She knelt down and gathered Lily close, meeting Sarah's shell-shocked gaze over the little girl's head. If that's what you want to call me, sweetheart, but only if you want to. Sarah's face was working through emotions too complex to name. You said you weren't trying to replace our mother. I'm not. Eleanor kept her voice steady despite the tears burning behind her eyes. Anna will always be your mother. I could never take that from her or from you. But if you need someone to fill that role now, someone to be there in the ways she can't be anymore, then I'm willing to try, not as a replacement, as something new. What if we can't? Sarah's voice broke. What if we try and it doesn't work, and you leave like everyone else? Eleanor stood, still holding Lily, but meeting Sarah's desperate gaze with absolute certainty. I just made legal vows that bind me to this family. But more than that, I made a choice to be here, to stay here, to build something with all of you. That choice doesn't change just because things get hard. Thomas had been silent through all of this, his young face struggling to process adult complexities. Now he looked at his father. Pa? Is this real? She's really staying? She's really staying. Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. We all are. Together. May, who had been watching from a respectful distance, chose that moment to clap her hands together. Good. Family drama is settled. Now I go home to my own family, who is probably wondering where I disappeared to. Eleanor, those cookies I brought are in the kitchen. Feed these children something sweet. They look like they need it. She paused at the gate, looking back with a smile that crinkled her whole face. Congratulations on your marriage. May it be long and boring and full of healthy children who drive you only slightly crazy. After May left, the family stood in the yard in awkward silence, nobody quite sure how to proceed. Eleanor took a breath and made an executive decision. I think we should have a special supper tonight, to mark the occasion. Thomas, would you help me bring up preserves from the root cellar? Sarah, can you set the table with the good dishes? And Lily, you can help me choose which cookies we're having for dessert. The familiar rhythm of tasks broke the paralysis. The children scattered to their assigned duties, and Eleanor found herself alone with Caleb in the yard. That went better than I feared, he said quietly. Lily called me Mama. Eleanor's voice trembled slightly. I didn't expect that. She's young enough to need it without fighting it. Caleb studied Eleanor's face. Does it bother you? If it does, we can talk to her. No. Eleanor surprised herself with the certainty. No, it doesn't bother me. It terrifies me because what if I fail her? What if I'm not enough? But it doesn't bother me. You won't fail her. You haven't failed any of them yet. Caleb hesitated, then added, Anna would approve, I think. Of you, of this. She'd want her children loved and protected, however that needed to happen. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Then she straightened her shoulders and headed toward the house, where children waited and supper needed cooking and a new life as Mrs. Caleb Ross required navigation. The inquiry happened on Thursday as scheduled. 2 officials arrived in an official-looking carriage, a severe woman with a clipboard and a tired-looking man who seemed to wish he were anywhere else. They inspected the house with critical eyes, asked the children questions in stern voices, examined Eleanor and Caleb's marriage certificate with obvious suspicion. This is very recently filed, the woman said, her tone suggesting fraud. Yes, ma'am. Caleb's voice was respectful but firm. We saw no reason to delay once we'd made our decision. How convenient, right before our scheduled visit. Convenient for us, inconvenient for whoever tried to make trouble where there wasn't any. Caleb met her gaze steadily. My wife runs a good household and teaches my children well. You're welcome to examine their schoolwork, inspect our supplies, ask whatever questions you need, but you won't find anything improper because there's nothing improper to find. The officials separated the children for individual interviews. Eleanor waited in the kitchen with her hands clenched in her lap, listening to muffled voices from the main room and trying not to imagine worst-case scenarios. When Sarah emerged, she came straight to Eleanor. I told them the truth, that you're a good teacher and you take care of us, and the house is better now than it's been since Ma died. I told them. She paused, swallowing hard. I told them you're not trying to replace Ma, but you're trying to be what we need now. And that's enough. Eleanor pulled Sarah into a fierce hug. Thank you, sweetheart. Thomas was next, looking shaken but resolute. They asked if Pa ever leaves us alone with you. I said yes, all the time, because you're our stepmother now, and that's what stepmothers do. They seemed surprised we knew the word stepmother. You did well, Eleanor assured him. When Lily went in for her interview, she carried her slate with her. Eleanor learned later that when asked if she was happy in the household, Lily had simply written yes in large letters and shown it to the officials. Then she'd written Mama and pointed at Eleanor through the doorway. The inspection concluded with the severe woman making notes on her clipboard while the tired man examined Caleb's ranch ledgers and Eleanor's meticulously updated household accounts. Finally, they convened in the main room where the whole family waited. "The household appears to be adequately maintained," the woman said, her tone suggesting she was disappointed not to find grounds for removal. "The children are clean, well-fed, and receiving education appropriate to their ages. The marriage certificate, while recently filed, appears legitimate. We see no immediate cause for intervention." Eleanor felt Caleb's hand find hers under the table, squeezing once with relief and gratitude. "However," the woman continued, "we will be monitoring this situation. Any complaints or concerns raised in the future will trigger another investigation. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Caleb and Eleanor said in unison. After the officials left, the family sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then Thomas started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that broke the tension like shattering glass. "We did it," he said. "They can't separate us." "No," Caleb agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "They can't." That night, after the children were in bed, Eleanor and Caleb sat together at the kitchen table with coffee and the comfortable quiet of people who'd weathered a storm together. "I need to tell you something," Eleanor said, turning her cup in her hands. "When I came here, I was running away. From Boston, from people who defined me by what I couldn't give them, from expectations I couldn't meet. I thought if I could just find a place where nobody knew me, where I could be useful without being measured against impossible standards, I'd be happy." "And are you?" Caleb asked quietly. "Happy?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I'm not sure happy is the right word. I'm needed here, which is different. I'm building something that matters, which feels better than happiness. She paused, searching for truth. "I'm becoming someone I didn't know I could be. A teacher, a housekeeper, a wife, at least on paper. And maybe, if those children want it, something like a mother. Not Anna. Never Anna. But someone who stays. That's all any of us can ask for," Caleb said. "Someone who stays." They sat in companionable silence, and Eleanor realized that this quiet partnership, this shared purpose, this household built on honesty rather than romance, felt more real than any of the futures she'd been offered in Boston. She'd come west to escape being defined by marriage and motherhood, only to find that accepting both on her own terms, for her own reasons, didn't diminish her at all. It might even be setting her free. The freedom Eleanor had discovered came with a weight she hadn't anticipated. Being Mrs. Ross meant something different in town than it did at the ranch. When she accompanied Caleb to the mercantile the following week, women who'd previously looked through her now nodded with grudging acceptance. The whispers changed from scandalized speculation to a different kind of judgment, the measuring gaze of wives evaluating whether she'd earned her place among them. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, cornered Eleanor by the fabric display with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Ross, how lovely to see you properly settled. I must say we were all quite surprised by how quickly the wedding happened." "It seemed practical given the circumstances," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice neutral as she examined a bolt of cotton. "The children needed stability." "Of course the children." Mrs. Patterson's tone suggested she believed no such thing. "Still, it must be quite an adjustment, going from hired help to mistress of the household overnight." Eleanor met the woman's gaze directly. "I was never hired help, Mrs. Patterson. I was a teacher and housekeeper. Now I'm a wife and stepmother. The work itself hasn't changed much, just the legal standing." She selected the cotton and moved toward the counter, ending the conversation with polite finality. But the encounter left her unsettled. She'd thought marriage would silence the gossip, but instead it had simply redirected it. Now, instead of questioning her morals, people questioned her motives. "Gold digger," some whispered, opportunist who'd trapped a grieving widower, calculating woman who'd used his children to secure her position. "Don't let them get to you," Caleb said on the ride home, after Eleanor had relayed the conversation with unusual bitterness. "People will always find something to criticize. Best to just live your life and let your actions speak for themselves." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one being measured against a dead saint." Eleanor regretted the words the moment they left her mouth. "I'm sorry. That was unkind." "No, it was honest." Caleb's hands were steady on the reins, his profile unreadable. "Anna wasn't a saint. She was a good woman who worked hard and loved her children, but she had her flaws like anyone. People forget that because it's easier to idealize the dead than remember them as they actually were. What was she really like? Eleanor asked softly. Not the legend everyone talks about. The real Anna. Caleb was quiet for so long, Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, she was stubborn as a mule. Refused to admit when she was wrong about something. Got so focused on a task she'd forget to eat. Terrible at asking for help, even when she needed it desperately. His voice softened with memory. But she made the house feel warm even in winter. Sang while she worked, off-key, but happy. Taught the children to see wonder in ordinary things. And she loved me even when I didn't deserve it, which was more often than I like to admit. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Not jealousy exactly, but a recognition of the impossible standard she'd been measuring herself against. I can't be that for them. That kind of warmth, that kind of natural mothering, it doesn't come easily to me. They don't need you to be Anna. Caleb glanced at her, his gray eyes serious. They need you to be Eleanor, steady and smart and honest. Someone who keeps her promises and doesn't run when things get hard. That's worth more than warmth in the long run. The words settled into Eleanor like seeds finding soil. She'd spent so long trying not to be something, not to be the barren disappointment Boston had labeled her, not to be the replacement everyone seemed to expect, that she'd forgotten to simply be herself. Competent, reserved, more comfortable with books than sentiment, but capable of deep loyalty once it was earned. Maybe that was enough. The weeks that followed established new rhythms in the household. Eleanor continued teaching the children each morning, but now Sarah sat close enough that their shoulders touched during reading lessons. Thomas started bringing her questions unprompted, seeking her opinion on everything from arithmetic to whether it was normal to feel angry at his mother for dying. And Lily, precious Lily, had taken to calling Eleanor Mama with such casual certainty that even Sarah had stopped flinching at the sound. One afternoon in late October, Eleanor was helping Sarah with a particularly difficult composition when raised voices erupted from outside. She and Sarah rushed to the window to see Caleb and Thomas facing off in the yard, both their faces flushed with anger. "I'm not a child anymore," Thomas's voice cracked with adolescent fury. "I can handle the north pasture on my own." "You're 12 years old," Caleb shot back. "That fence line runs close to Murphy Land, and they've been having trouble with rustlers. I'm not risking you getting caught up in something dangerous." "You just don't trust me." Thomas's hands were clenched into fists. "You think I'm going to mess everything up like I always do." "That's not what I said. It's what you meant." Thomas wheeled around and stormed toward the barn, his shoulders shaking with emotion. Caleb stood frozen in the yard, frustration and helplessness warring on his face. Eleanor made a decision quickly, turning to Sarah. "Keep Lily with you. I need to talk to your father." She found Caleb still standing where Thomas had left him, staring at the barn with the expression of a man who'd just watched something precious slip through his fingers. "He's 12, Eleanor said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "Old enough to want independence, young enough to not know how to ask for it properly." "I know that." Caleb's voice was rough. "But he doesn't understand the dangers. Murphy's had 2 heads stolen in the past month. There are men out there who wouldn't think twice about hurting a boy if he got in their way. So tell him that. Not as a father laying down law, but as one rancher explaining reality to another." Eleanor touched his arm gently. "He needs to feel trusted, Caleb. He's been the man of this house in his own mind since Anna died. Now you're back to full strength, and he doesn't know where he fits anymore." Caleb looked at her with something like wonder. "How do you know that?" "Because I was paying attention." Eleanor smiled slightly. "That's what teachers do. We watch how children navigate their worlds and try to help them make sense of the journey. Will you talk to him? You're better at this than I am." "No." Eleanor squeezed his arm once and let go. "This is between you and your son. He needs to hear from you that he matters, that his feelings are valid, that you see him becoming a man. I can't give him that. Only you can." Caleb nodded slowly, then squared his shoulders and walked toward the barn. Eleanor returned to the house where Sarah was waiting by the window, Lily clutched protectively in her arms. "Are they going to fight?" Sarah's voice was small, younger than her 9 years. No, sweetheart, they're going to talk. There's a difference. Eleanor gathered both girls close. Your father and brother love each other very much. Sometimes love looks like anger when people don't know how to say what they really mean. They waited together, the three of them, until Caleb and Thomas emerged from the barn nearly an hour later. Thomas's eyes were red, but his shoulders were straighter. Caleb's hand rested on his son's shoulder with a gentleness that made Eleanor's throat tight. That night at supper, Caleb announced that Thomas would be riding the North Pasture line starting next week, with proper training first, and with the understanding that he'd report any suspicious activity immediately rather than trying to handle it himself. Thomas's smile could have lit the whole territory. Thank you, Caleb said to Eleanor later after the children were in bed. They were in the kitchen, Eleanor washing dishes while he dried, a routine they'd fallen into without discussing it. For knowing what I needed to do, even when I didn't. You would have figured it out, Eleanor handed him a wet plate. You're a better father than you give yourself credit for. I'm trying to be. He set the plate on the stack with careful precision. It's harder without Anna. She knew how to navigate their feelings. I just know how to fix fences and breed cattle. You're learning the rest. Eleanor plunged her hands back into the warm water. We both are. The words hung between them, acknowledging something that had been growing quietly in the spaces of their practical partnership. They were learning each other, learning this strange marriage that wasn't a marriage, learning to be partners in raising children neither of them had fully chosen, but both were committed to protecting. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow and thick blankets that transformed the ranch into something from a storybook. Eleanor woke one morning to find Lily's face pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared in wonder at the white landscape. First big snow, Sarah explained, appearing at Eleanor's elbow with coffee already poured. Lily was only 3 last time it snowed like this. She doesn't really remember. Eleanor accepted the coffee gratefully, touched by the gesture. Sarah had been bringing her coffee in the mornings lately, a small kindness that felt like trust being built cup by cup. Should we take her out to play in it? Sarah's face lit up with an expression Eleanor had never seen before, pure childish joy, untempered by grief or responsibility. Really? We can? Of course we can. After breakfast and chores, we'll bundle up and build a snowman. Or a snow fort. Whatever you'd like. Eleanor ruffled Sarah's hair gently, a gesture she'd been working up the courage to try. When Sarah leaned into the touch rather than pulling away, Eleanor's heart did something complicated in her chest. The morning was chaos in the best way, finding mittens and scarves, layering clothes until the children looked like small moving bundles of wool. Caleb and Thomas had morning chores regardless of weather, but they promised to join the snow activities when the barn work was done. Outside, the world was transformed. Snow-muffled sound made everything clean and new. Lily threw herself into the drifts with abandon, laughing, actually laughing, as snow covered her face and hair. Sarah showed her how to make snow angels, their shapes pressed into perfect whiteness like secrets the earth was keeping. Eleanor helped them build a snowman using stones for eyes and a carrot from the kitchen for the nose. It was lopsided and slightly sinister looking, but the girls declared it perfect. They named him Chester and insisted he needed a hat. So Eleanor sacrificed one of her old bonnets to crown their creation. Mama, look! Lily's voice rang out clear and strong. I made a snowbird! Eleanor turned to see Lily holding up a small mound of packed snow with twigs stuck in for wings. The casual use of mama, combined with Lily's obvious pride in her creation, hit Eleanor with unexpected force. This child who'd barely spoken when Eleanor arrived now chattered constantly, her silence broken by trust and time and the simple accumulation of days spent feeling safe. It's beautiful, sweetheart. Eleanor crouched down to examine the snowbird properly, very creative with the wing placement. It's like the birds that come to our feeder, Lily explained seriously, the brown ones with the red on their chests. Robins, Sarah supplied. Ma used to say they were her favorite because they meant spring was coming. The mention of Anna could have been awkward, but Sarah's tone was matter-of-fact, sharing a memory rather than wielding it as a weapon. Eleanor met her eyes over Lily's head and saw something she'd been hoping for: acceptance. Not replacement, not forgetting, but making room for both the mother they'd lost and the one they'd found. Caleb and Thomas emerged from the barn to find the yard transformed into a winter wonderland of questionable sculptures and laughing females. Thomas immediately joined in, helping Sarah build a snow fort while Caleb stood beside Eleanor, watching his children play with an expression of such profound relief it was almost painful to witness. "Haven't heard them laugh like that in 2 years," he said quietly. "They're healing." Eleanor brushed snow from her skirts. "It takes time, but they're getting there. Because of you." Caleb turned to face her fully. "I know we agreed this marriage was just for legal protection, but Eleanor, you've given them something I couldn't. Hope that life can be good again, that it's okay to be happy even though their mother is gone." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold. "I'm just doing what any—" "Don't." Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. "Don't diminish what you've done. You came here as a stranger and turned this house back into a home. You've earned the right to take credit for that." Before Eleanor could respond, a snowball hit Caleb square in the back. They turned to find Thomas trying to look innocent while Sarah giggled behind her hand. "Oh, you think that's funny?" Caleb's grin was sudden and transformative. He scooped up snow with speed that suggested practice. "Eleanor, we're under attack. Time to show these children how it's done." What followed was chaos. Snowballs flying, alliances forming and breaking, laughter echoing across the white landscape. Eleanor found herself dodging and throwing with abandon, her careful reserve forgotten in the pure joy of play. When Caleb grabbed her hand to pull her behind the dubious shelter of Chester the Snowman, she didn't pull away. When Thomas declared her the best shot on their team, pride swelled in her chest. When Lily abandoned the battle to hug Eleanor's legs and declare this the best day ever, Eleanor had to blink back tears. They stumbled back into the house eventually, wet and freezing and happier than Eleanor could remember being in years. She made hot cocoa while the children changed into dry clothes, Caleb helping to stoke the fire back to roaring life. "Thank you," he said as she handed him a steaming cup. "For today, for every day, for being exactly who they needed you to be." Eleanor wanted to say something profound, something that would capture the strange gratitude she felt for this life she'd stumbled into. But all that came out was, "Thank you for letting me stay." The look he gave her suggested he understood everything she hadn't said. December brought unexpected challenges. A cold snap froze the water pump, requiring Caleb to break ice from the trough twice daily. Thomas caught a fever that had Eleanor sitting beside his bed through 2 long nights, monitoring his temperature and forcing fluids while Caleb paced the hallway outside. Sarah took over teaching Lily during the crisis, proving she'd absorbed more from Eleanor's lessons than anyone had realized. When Thomas finally broke the fever and demanded real food, Eleanor nearly wept with relief. She made him broth and biscuits, sat beside his bed while he ate, and let him hold her hand when exhaustion made him vulnerable enough to accept comfort. "I'm glad Pa married you," he said drowsily, fighting sleep. "Even if it was just for paperwork. You're good at being here." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I'm glad I'm here too." "Do you think—" Thomas hesitated. "Do you think Ma would mind? That we're calling you Mama? That we're happy even though she's gone?" Eleanor chose her words carefully, aware of how much weight they carried. "I think your mother loved you more than anything in the world. And people who love that much want their children to be happy, even if they can't be the ones providing that happiness anymore. She'd want you to live, Thomas, to laugh and grow and build a good life. Honoring her memory doesn't mean staying sad forever." Thomas nodded against his pillow, tears sliding down his fevered cheeks. "I miss her, but I'm glad you're here too. Is that okay?" "Yes, sweetheart." Eleanor smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "That's more than okay. That's exactly how it should be." He fell asleep holding her hand, and Eleanor sat there long after his breathing had evened out, watching this boy who'd let her into his carefully guarded heart and feeling the weight and wonder of that trust. Christmas approached with surprising warmth despite the snow outside. Eleanor had never celebrated much in Boston. Her family was small and reserved, marking the day with church and a modest meal. But Anna had left traditions that the children remembered and cherished, and Eleanor was determined to honor them. Sarah showed her how Anna had decorated with pine boughs and red ribbon, how she'd made special cookies in shapes of stars and trees, how she'd told stories by the fire on Christmas Eve about shepherds and wise men and a baby born in a stable. "Will you tell the stories this year?" Sarah asked tentatively. "The way Ma used to?" Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, to suggest Sarah tell them instead. But looking at the girl's hopeful face, she understood what was really being asked. Sarah wanted to know if Eleanor could carry forward what Anna had started, if she could hold traditions sacred while making them her own. "I'd be honored," Eleanor said, "but you'll need to help me remember all the details, your mother's way of telling them." They spent an evening in preparation, Sarah recounting the stories while Eleanor took notes, learning the particular phrases and inflections that made these narratives special to the Ross children. It was an act of such profound trust that Eleanor felt the responsibility of it settle deep in her bones. On Christmas Eve, with the fire crackling and pine scent filling the air, Eleanor gathered the children close and began the familiar stories. She stumbled over some words, forgot others, but Sarah whispered prompts, and Thomas smiled encouragement and Lily's eyes grew round with wonder. Caleb listened from his chair, his expression unreadable, until Eleanor caught the shine of tears on his cheeks. Afterward, they exchanged simple gifts. Eleanor had knitted scarves for each child, using wool she'd purchased on their last trip to town. The children gave her small treasures, a drawing from Lily, a carved bookmark from Thomas, a recipe book from Sarah with Anna's recipes carefully copied inside. "So you can make things the way Ma did," Sarah explained. "But also so you can add your own. There are blank pages at the end." Eleanor clutched the book to her chest, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Caleb's gift was last and simplest, a framed photograph of the family, taken by the traveling photographer who'd passed through town in November. Caleb and Eleanor stood behind the three children, formal and proper. But if you look closely, you could see Eleanor's hand resting gently on Lily's shoulder, Caleb's on Thomas's. Sarah positioned exactly between them all, as if she was the bridge holding everyone together. "For your room," Caleb said quietly, "so you remember you belong here." Eleanor looked at the image. This family she'd somehow become part of, this life she'd built from practical necessity that had transformed into something real, and felt the last of her Boston ghosts finally release their hold. "I won't forget," she whispered. That night, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor caught her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. She looked different than she had when she'd arrived, thinner from the work, more weathered from the sun and wind, but also more solid somehow, more present. A woman who knew her worth not because someone had told her, but because she'd proven it daily through actions and choices and showing up even when things were hard. Mrs. Caleb Ross, she thought. Eleanor Ross. A name she'd taken for legal protection had become an identity she'd grown into. She was a teacher, a housekeeper, a stepmother, a wife, at least on paper. She was someone children trusted and a man respected. She was enough, exactly as she was. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Eleanor?" Caleb's voice through the door. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" She opened the door to find him in the hallway, still dressed, but looking uncertain in a way she rarely saw from him. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized as nervousness. "I wanted to say something before I lost my courage." Eleanor's heart began beating faster. "All right." This marriage started as a legal arrangement, protection for the children and for your reputation. We agreed nothing would change between us personally. Caleb met her eyes, his own gray gaze steady despite the vulnerability in his voice. "But things have changed, Eleanor, at least for me. And I need to know if they've changed for you too." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The hallway suddenly felt too small, too intimate, with Caleb standing close enough that she could see the firelight from the main room reflected in his eyes. She'd spent months building careful walls between what this marriage was supposed to be and what it was becoming, and now he was standing here asking her to acknowledge that those walls had crumbled somewhere along the way without either of them noticing. "Changed how?" Her voice was steadier than she felt. Caleb took a breath, and she watched him gather courage the same way he gathered himself before difficult ranch work, with determination and honesty. I respect you, Eleanor. I admire your intelligence and your strength. I'm grateful for everything you've done for my children. But somewhere in the past few months, gratitude became something else, something more, searching her face. I've come to care for you, not as a housekeeper or even as a partner in raising the children, as a woman I want to build a real life with, a real marriage. Eleanor's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to protect herself, to refuse before she could be hurt. She'd built this entire life on the premise that she would never be enough for a man who wanted a true wife, a real mother for his children, that her barrenness made her fundamentally insufficient for the role everyone seemed to want her to fill. But looking at Caleb's face, vulnerable and open in a way she'd never seen him, Eleanor realized something profound. He wasn't asking her to be something she wasn't. He was asking her to be exactly who she'd already become, the woman who'd made his house a home, who'd loved his children into healing, who'd proven day after day that worth wasn't measured by what you could give a man, but by who you chose to be. I'm afraid, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I came here because I'd been told I wasn't enough, that I couldn't be a real wife because I can't bear children. And even though you already have children, even though that's not what you're asking of me, I'm terrified that eventually you'll realize I'm still not enough, that I'm too reserved, too practical, not warm enough, or maternal enough, or stop. Caleb's hands came up to cup her face with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. Eleanor, you are exactly enough. You're more than enough. You think I don't see how Sarah watches you for approval now, instead of looking at you like an intruder? How Thomas comes to you first when he's troubled. How Lily lights up every time you walk into a room. His thumbs brushed away tears she hadn't realized were falling. You think I don't notice how you've made this house feel alive again? How you've given my children back their childhood while teaching them to be strong and capable? How you've helped me become a better father just by being patient enough to show me what I was missing? That's just practical partnership, Eleanor tried, but her voice wavered. No, it's not. It's love, Eleanor. Maybe not the romantic kind that starts with poetry and courtship, but the real kind that's built through shared work and mutual respect in choosing each other every single day. Caleb's eyes searched hers. I'm choosing you, not because I need a housekeeper or a teacher for my children, because you're the woman I want to wake up beside and work alongside and build a future with. The question is whether you can choose me too. Eleanor thought about Boston, about the life she'd left behind, about the woman who'd boarded that stagecoach convinced she was running away from everything she couldn't be. Then she thought about the woman she'd become here. Stronger, surer, someone who'd discovered that the most important kind of motherhood had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with showing up. Someone who'd learned that worth wasn't given by others, but claimed through action and choice, and refusing to let fear dictate the shape of her life. I choose you, she whispered. I choose this, all of it, not because it's practical or safe, but because somewhere in the chaos of cooking and teaching and trying to honor Anna's memory while finding my own place, I fell in love with your children, and with you, with the man who trusted me enough to let me into his family's life, who sees me as I am and thinks that's enough. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, two people learning a new language after months of careful distance. But then Caleb's arms came around her properly, and Eleanor let herself lean into the embrace, into the solid reality of this man who'd offered her partnership and was now offering something far more precious, the chance to be chosen not despite her limitations, but because of who she'd proven herself to be within them. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Eleanor laughed shakily. The children are going to have questions. Let them question. Caleb's smile was warm, transforming his usually serious face. We'll tell them the truth, that we started as practical partners and became something real, that sometimes the best marriages grow from friendship and respect rather than grand passion, that their mother will always be their mother, but you're not a replacement. You're something new, something equally precious. They stood in the hallway for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, until the sound of small feet made them pull apart. Lily appeared in her nightgown, rubbing sleepy eyes. Mama? Papa? Why are you in the hallway? The casual use of Papa for Caleb instead of Pa stopped them both. Lily had always called him Pa, the way Anna had. This was new, a way of marking that things had shifted, that the family structure had evolved into something different but equally valid. We were just talking, sweetheart, Eleanor said, moving to scoop Lily up. The little girl came willingly, wrapping her arms around Eleanor's neck with the casual trust of a child who knew she was loved. Did you have a bad dream? No, I just wanted to make sure you were still here. Lily's eyes were already drifting closed again, safe in Eleanor's arms. Sometimes I wake up and get scared everyone will disappear. Caleb touched Lily's back gently. We're not going anywhere, little one. This is our home. All of us together. Eleanor carried Lily back to the room she shared with Sarah, tucking her into bed beside her sister. Sarah was awake too, watching with knowing eyes that suggested she'd heard more of the hallway conversation than Eleanor would have preferred. About time, Sarah whispered as Eleanor leaned down to kiss her forehead. You two have been dancing around each other for weeks. It was getting painful to watch. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. You're too observant for your own good. Ma always said that too. Sarah's smile was soft in the lamplight. But she also said being observant meant caring about people enough to pay attention. I pay attention because I care, Mama, about you and Pa and all of us. I want us to be happy, really happy, not just pretending. We are happy, Eleanor assured her, and we're going to keep being happy. Together. She returned to the hallway to find Caleb waiting, and this time when he took her hand it felt natural, right? Like something that should have been happening all along. They walked to the main room together, to the dying fire and the pine boughs and the peaceful silence of a house full of sleeping children and new possibilities. I should probably go to my room, Eleanor said, but she didn't move to leave. You should. Caleb didn't let go of her hand. But Eleanor, I want you to know this doesn't have to change overnight. We can take whatever time you need to feel comfortable with this being real. I'm not going anywhere. I know. Eleanor squeezed his hand. That's what makes this possible. Knowing you see me as I am, and that's what you want, not some idealized version or replacement for what you lost. Just me. Just you, Caleb confirmed. Although there's nothing just about you, Eleanor Ross. You're extraordinary, even if you're too modest to see it. Eleanor went to bed that night with her heart full and her mind spinning with the magnitude of what had shifted. She'd come to New Mexico territory running from the expectation that marriage and motherhood defined a woman's worth. Now she was choosing both, but on her own terms, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than romantic fantasy or social obligation. The winter days that followed were outwardly the same, lessons and meals and endless household tasks, but everything felt different now. Caleb's hand on her shoulder as he passed behind her chair at breakfast, the way their eyes met across the room and held for a moment longer than strictly necessary. Small touches that spoke of affection rather than mere courtesy. The children noticed, of course. Thomas developed a habit of finding urgent tasks elsewhere whenever his father and Eleanor were alone together, his ears turning red with embarrassment. Sarah smiled with knowing satisfaction, and Lily simply accepted it with a child's flexible certainty that, of course, Mama and Papa loved each other because that's what parents did. January brought a cold snap that froze everything solid and tested the family's resources. The cattle needed constant tending, water sources had to be broken free of ice multiple times daily, and the house required constant fire feeding to stay warm. Eleanor worked alongside Caleb and Thomas with a determination that earned new respect from both. She might have been a city woman once, but she'd become a rancher's wife in truth now, understanding that survival here required everyone contributing regardless of traditional gender roles. One particularly brutal morning, Eleanor was helping Caleb break ice from the trough when a rider appeared on the horizon. Visitors were rare in winter, and the sight immediately put Caleb on alert. He handed Eleanor the axe and moved to intercept the stranger before he reached the house. Eleanor watched from the barn as Caleb spoke with the rider, their conversation too distant to hear but clearly tense from their body language. After several minutes, the rider wheeled his horse and departed the way he'd come. Caleb stood watching until horse and rider disappeared into the white landscape, then returned to where Eleanor waited. "Trouble?" she asked, reading the concern in his face. "Maybe." That was Johnson from the Territorial Land Office. "There's been a challenge to our property deed. Some claim that the original survey was faulty and our eastern boundary encroaches on public land." Caleb's jaw was tight with anger. "It's nonsense. Anna and I had the survey done properly when we first claimed this place. But it means lawyers and hearings and possibly losing part of the ranch if we can't prove our case." Eleanor felt ice that had nothing to do with the weather settle in her stomach. "What do we need to do?" "Find the original survey documents and deed. Anna kept everything filed carefully, but I haven't looked at those papers in years. They should be in the trunk in her room." Caleb corrected himself awkwardly, still not comfortable calling it their room, even though Eleanor had never actually moved her belongings into it. "I'll look," Eleanor said firmly. "You have livestock to tend. I can search through documents." The trunk Caleb indicated was at the foot of the bed in what had been his and Anna's room. Eleanor had rarely entered this space, respecting it as Caleb's private domain even after their marriage became real in feeling, if not yet fully in practice. Now she knelt before the trunk with something close to reverence, aware she was about to handle items that had been precious to the woman whose absence still shaped this household in countless small ways. The trunk was meticulously organized, exactly as Eleanor would have expected from Anna's careful nature. Legal documents were separated from personal correspondence, everything dated and labeled. Eleanor found the property deed easily, along with the original survey notes. But as she dug deeper, she discovered something else. A journal, leather-bound and worn, with Anna's name inscribed on the inside cover. Eleanor knew she shouldn't read it. This was private, intimate, not meant for her eyes. But the journal had fallen open to a page dated just months before Anna's death, and Eleanor's eyes caught on her own name before she could look away. Caleb speaks of hiring a teacher from back east, Miss Eleanor Hale, educated and competent by all accounts. "I confess I'm grateful. I've been trying to teach the children myself, but I'm so tired lately, and Thomas especially needs more than I can give him now. I hope this Miss Hale proves worthy of the trust we're placing in her. I hope she sees my children for the precious souls they are. And selfishly, I hope she stays when I'm no longer here to care for them myself." Eleanor's hands trembled as she turned the page, finding more entries that spoke of Anna's growing illness, her fear for her children's future, her desperate hope that someone would be there to love them when she could not. "I'm dying. The doctor won't say it outright, but I know. I can feel my body failing piece by piece. My greatest fear is not death itself, but leaving my babies alone. Caleb is a good father, but he'll need help. He'll need a woman's hand to guide them through grief. I pray Miss Hale proves to be that woman. I pray she has the strength to love children who aren't hers by birth. I pray she stays when Caleb is too grief-struck to know how to ask her to." Eleanor pressed the journal to her chest, tears streaming down her face. All this time she'd been measuring herself against Anna's memory, terrified of failing to live up to an impossible standard. But Anna hadn't wanted perfection. She'd wanted exactly what Eleanor had tried to give: someone to stay, to care, to love her children through the aftermath of loss. "Eleanor?" Caleb's voice from the doorway made her look up. He took in the journal, her tears, and his expression shifted to understanding. "You found her diary. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry. It fell open and I saw my name." Eleanor's voice broke. Caleb crossed the room and knelt beside her, taking the journal gently and reading the passage that had undone her. His own eyes filled as he read Anna's words, her hope and fear preserved in ink. "She knew," he said quietly. "Somehow she knew you'd be the one, that you'd love them the way they deserved, that you'd stay even when it was hard." He looked at Eleanor with wonder. "She was preparing the way for you before we'd even met." Eleanor thought about the woman she'd never known, but whose presence had shaped every day of her life here. Anna had left behind more than memories and traditions. She'd left a roadmap in her meticulous household ledgers, her carefully preserved recipes, her children raised to value education and kindness. She'd been preparing her family to survive without her, and in doing so she'd created space for Eleanor to step into without having to erase what came before. "I wish I could have known her," Eleanor whispered. I wish I could tell her that I'm doing my best, that her children are thriving, that I love them so much it frightens me sometimes. She knows. Caleb's voice was certain. Wherever she is, she knows. And she's grateful, Eleanor, as grateful as I am. They sat together on the floor beside Anna's trunk, surrounded by documents and memories, until Thomas's voice calling for lunch reminded them that the present demanded attention as much as the past. Eleanor helped Caleb gather the property documents they'd need for the legal challenge, but she also carefully returned Anna's journal to its place in the trunk, a piece of history that had given her unexpected peace. The legal battle over the property consumed the next several weeks. Caleb made multiple trips to town to meet with lawyers and present documentation. Eleanor ran the ranch in his absence, working with Thomas to manage the livestock and keep the household functioning. It was exhausting, relentless work that left her collapsing into bed each night too tired to think. But it also revealed something important. She wasn't just capable of managing a household anymore. She was capable of running a ranch, making decisions about breeding stock and pasture rotation and when to sell versus when to hold. The skills she'd absorbed through observation and asking questions now manifested in confident action. Thomas deferred to her judgment without question. Even the neighboring ranchers who stopped by expressed respect for how she was handling things in Caleb's absence. When Caleb finally returned with news that the challenge had been dismissed, the original survey was sound, the eastern boundary secure, Eleanor was negotiating with a cattle buyer over spring prices. Caleb stood in the barn doorway watching with undisguised admiration as Eleanor drove a hard bargain and got the price she wanted. "Remind me never to underestimate you," he said after the buyer left, pulling her into an embrace that felt like coming home. "You've been running this place better than I could have." "I had a good teacher." Eleanor leaned into his warmth, feeling muscles she hadn't realized were tense finally relax, and a stubborn determination not to let anything fall apart on my watch. "Our watch," Caleb corrected. "This is your ranch too, Eleanor. Your home. I should have made that clear long ago." That night at supper, Caleb made an announcement. "I've been thinking about something. This ranch has been called the Ross Place since Anna and I founded it, but it's not just mine anymore, it's ours. Mine and Eleanor's and all three of you children's. So I'm proposing we give it a proper name, something that reflects all of us together." "What kind of name, Lyle?" Thomas asked, intrigued. "I was thinking Hope Springs Ranch." Caleb looked at Eleanor. "Because that's what this place has become. A place where hope springs eternal, where people who've lost everything can find new beginnings, where a broken family became whole again." Sarah's eyes were bright with tears. "Ma would have loved that." "She would," Caleb agreed, "and I think she'd be proud of all of us, of how we've honored her memory by building something new without forgetting what she gave us." Lily raised her cup of milk solemnly. "To Hope Springs Ranch." They all raised their cups, toasting the future while honoring the past, and Eleanor felt the last piece of her old life finally let go. She wasn't the woman who'd fled Boston anymore. She was Eleanor Ross, co-owner of Hope Springs Ranch, stepmother to 3 remarkable children, wife to a man who saw her worth and chose her anyway. Spring arrived with explosive color, wildflowers transforming the landscape into something almost painfully beautiful. Eleanor started a garden, working the soil with Sarah beside her, planting vegetables and herbs that would sustain them through the next winter. Lily helped with the watering, carrying her small bucket with fierce determination. Thomas worked the fields with his father, his shoulders broadening, his voice deepening, becoming more man than boy with each passing week. One evening in late April, Eleanor was reading to Lily on the porch when Sarah approached with unusual hesitancy. "Mama, can I ask you something?" Eleanor set the book aside, giving Sarah her full attention. "Of course, sweetheart. What is it?" "Do you think, Sarah twisted her hands together nervously. "Do you think you and Pa might have a baby someday? A baby that would be yours and his together?" Eleanor's breath caught. She'd known this question might come eventually, but she hadn't prepared an answer. The old shame tried to rise, the familiar conviction that her barrenness made her less than, insufficient, a failure as a woman. But looking at Sarah's open, curious face, Eleanor found a different truth. "I don't know if I can have babies, Sarah. That's something my body may not be capable of doing. Eleanor kept her voice steady, refusing to let old hurt color the honesty this moment required. But whether I can or can't, it doesn't change how much I love you and your brother and sister. You three are my children in every way that matters, not because I gave birth to you, but because I choose you every single day. That's what makes someone a mother, the choosing, the staying, the loving, even when it's hard. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then she said, Jenny Miller at school said you couldn't really be our mother because you didn't have us in your belly. I told her she was stupid and got in trouble for it. Oh, Sarah, Eleanor pulled the girl close. You shouldn't have called her stupid, but I understand why you were angry. Some people think family is only about blood and biology, but they're wrong. Family is about who shows up, who stays, who loves you even when you're difficult and makes sure you have clean clothes and helps with your homework and sits beside your bed when you're sick. That's what family is. And by that measure, we're as real as any family that ever existed. That's what I think too, Sarah hugged Eleanor tightly. You're my mama, not instead of my first mama, but in addition to. Is that okay? That's more than okay. Eleanor kissed the top of Sarah's head. That's perfect. Caleb had been standing in the doorway, Eleanor realized, listening to the whole exchange. When Sarah ran off to resume playing with Lily, he came to sit beside Eleanor on the porch swing. You handled that beautifully, he said quietly. I just told her the truth. Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid comfort of his presence. That love makes family more than biology ever could. For what it's worth, Caleb said carefully, if you did want to try for a child of our own, I'd welcome that. But if you can't or don't want to, that's fine too. I have 3 children I love. You've become their mother in all the ways that count. That's already more than I dared hope for when I placed that advertisement in the Boston paper. Eleanor thought about the woman she'd been then, desperate, ashamed, running from a life that had become unbearable. And she thought about who she'd become here in this impossible territory with this unexpected family, stronger, surer. Someone who knew her worth wasn't measured by what her body could produce, but by what her heart could give and her hands could build. I think, she said slowly, that what we have is already complete. 3 children who need us. A ranch that requires all our effort and ingenuity. A partnership built on respect and honesty. Whether more children come or not, we're already a family. A real one. A real one, Caleb agreed, pulling her closer. Built on hope and hard work, and refusing to let the past dictate the future. They sat together as the sun set over Hope Springs Ranch, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Inside the house, Eleanor could hear the children's laughter as they played some game that involved dramatic storytelling and Lily's delighted squeals. It was the sound of healing, of life reclaimed, of hope that had indeed sprung eternal in the least likely place. 5 years later, Eleanor stood in that same spot on the porch, watching Thomas ride out with his father to check the northern boundary. He was 17 now, tall and confident, already talking about expanding the cattle operation. Sarah, at 14, was inside teaching a handful of younger children from neighboring ranches. Eleanor had started a small school in the addition they'd built onto the house, and Sarah had proven to be a natural teacher, carrying on the legacy in her own right. And Lily, now 10 years old and anything but silent, was in the barn currying her horse while singing at the top of her lungs. The ranch had prospered under Eleanor and Caleb's joint management. They'd bought additional land, built better outbuildings, established a reputation for quality livestock that brought buyers from across the territory. But more than that, they'd built a life of genuine partnership, shared decisions, shared work, shared laughter around the dinner table. The marriage that had started as legal protection had become something far more precious, a true union of equals who chose each other daily and built something meaningful together. Eleanor's small school had grown too. 8 children now attended regularly, learning reading and mathematics and history from a teacher who understood that education was about more than memorizing facts. It was about helping children discover who they could become, what they were capable of, how to think rather than just what to think. Some of her former students had gone on to higher education, carrying the foundation she'd given them into larger worlds. It was, she thought, a legacy Anna would have been proud of. The Territorial Inquiry Board had never returned. The marriage certificate and the obvious thriving of the Ross children had silenced even the most dedicated gossips. Mrs. Patterson and her ilk had eventually accepted Eleanor as one of them, though Eleanor suspected the acceptance had more to do with respect for what she'd accomplished than any real warmth. That was fine. Eleanor had learned she didn't need everyone's approval, just the love of the people who mattered. Mei-Chen had become a true friend, stopping by weekly for tea and conversation. She'd been the one to hold Eleanor's hand through 2 miscarriages, the body's cruel reminder that some doors remained closed, no matter how much the heart wished them open. But May had also been the one to remind Eleanor that 3 thriving children was wealth beyond measure, that motherhood counted in moments of care rather than biological connection. That worth had nothing to do with what you couldn't do and everything to do with what you chose to give. Caleb came up behind her now, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. Thinking loud again. Just remembering. Eleanor leaned into his embrace. That terrified woman who stepped off the stagecoach 6 years ago, convinced she was running away from everything she couldn't be. And discovering she was running toward everything she actually was, Caleb finished. A teacher, a ranch manager, a mother, a wife. A woman who proved that worth is claimed, not given. We proved it together. Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. You gave me the space to become who I needed to be. You never asked me to be Anna or to fit some predetermined mold. You just let me be Eleanor. Best decision I ever made. Caleb kissed her forehead with the casual affection of long partnership. Well, besides placing that advertisement in the first place. Seeking educated woman for household management and children's instruction, Eleanor quoted with a smile. You certainly got more than you bargained for. I got exactly what I needed, even if I didn't know it at the time. Caleb's expression grew serious. Thank you, Eleanor, for staying when you could have left, for loving my children when you'd been told you couldn't be a mother, for building this life with me when neither of us were sure we'd ever find happiness again. Eleanor looked out at the ranch, their ranch, at the children who'd become hers through choice rather than biology, at the land they'd worked together to make productive and beautiful. She thought about Anna's journal entries, about hope and prayer and preparation, about how sometimes the greatest acts of love were the ones that made room for other people to love in your absence. I didn't know what I was running toward when I left Boston, she said quietly. I just knew I couldn't stay in a place that had decided who I was without asking me. But coming here, finding you and the children, building Hope Springs Ranch, it taught me something important. We don't always get to choose the circumstances we're given, but we do get to choose what we make of them. And I choose this. Every day, I choose this life, this family, this version of myself that I didn't know existed until I had the courage to claim it. Sarah called from inside. Supper was ready, the students had all gone home, and Lily was demanding her favorite cornbread. Thomas and Caleb would be back within the hour, hungry and ready to hear about everyone's day. It was ordinary, domestic, the kind of life Eleanor had once thought would suffocate her. Instead, it had set her free. As she and Caleb headed inside to the warmth and noise and beautiful chaos of family dinner, Eleanor caught sight of the framed photograph on the wall, the one from that first Christmas, showing a family in formation. But beside it now hung a newer photograph taken just last month. The same 5 people, but transformed by time and love. Thomas nearly as tall as his father. Sarah's face losing its childhood roundness, becoming elegant with approaching womanhood. Lily grinning with gap-toothed joy. Caleb's arm around Eleanor's shoulders. And Eleanor herself, looking directly at the camera with confidence that would have astonished the woman who'd fled Boston. This was who she'd become. Not despite the journey, but because of it. Not in rejection of what she couldn't be, but in embrace of what she chose to give. A teacher who'd learned her most important lessons from the children she taught. A wife who'd discovered that the deepest partnerships were built on honesty rather than romance. A mother who'd proven that the most important thing you could give a child was the decision to stay, to show up, to choose them again and again, even when it was hard. She was Eleanor Ross of Hope Springs Ranch, and she was finally, completely, enough. The evening unfolded as countless evenings had before. Food shared, stories told, small conflicts mediated, laughter that filled the house like light. After dinner, Thomas showed his father calculations for next season's breeding program. Sarah read aloud from a book of poetry while Lily drew pictures of horses. Caleb worked on accounts while Eleanor mended clothes, their companionable silence speaking of comfort and trust. When the children finally headed to bed, Eleanor made her rounds, kissing foreheads, straightening blankets, listening to the small stories and concerns that emerged in the safety of lamplight and approaching sleep. This ritual had become sacred to her, this final check that everyone she loved was safe and settled and ready for tomorrow. "Mama?" Lily's sleepy voice stopped her at the door. "Will you always be here? Even when I'm grown up?" "I'll always be your mother," Eleanor promised. "No matter how old you get or how far you travel, that doesn't change." "Good." Lily burrowed deeper into her blankets. "I like having you as my mama. You're exactly the right kind." Eleanor carried those words back to her own room, the room she now shared with Caleb, the last barrier between legal marriage and real partnership having fallen naturally over time. He was already in bed, reading by lamplight, and he looked up with a smile when she entered. "All settled?" "All settled." Eleanor changed into her nightgown and slipped under the quilts beside him. Lily wanted reassurance that I'll always be her mother. As if there was ever any doubt. Caleb set aside his book and pulled her close. "You know what I realized today? I can't remember what this house felt like before you came. You've been woven into the fabric of our lives so completely that it's like you were always here." "I feel the same way." Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Boston seems like someone else's life now, someone I used to be but barely recognize." "Any regrets?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, giving it the weight it deserved. She thought about the life she might have had if she'd stayed in Boston, found some compromise, accepted being less than whole. She thought about comfort and familiarity, about ease instead of challenge. And then she thought about 3 children sleeping peacefully down the hall, about a ranch that bore her name as much as Caleb's, about a purpose she'd discovered in the least likely place. "Not a single one," she said finally. "This life chose me as much as I chose it, and I wouldn't trade a moment of it for all the easy comfort Boston could have offered." Caleb kissed her temple, her cheek, finally her lips with the gentle passion of a man who knew he was loved, and returned that love with equal measure. "I love you, Eleanor Ross, for your strength and your stubbornness and your absolute refusal to be anything less than exactly who you are." "I love you too," Eleanor whispered back, "for giving me the space to discover who that was, for trusting me with your children's hearts, for building this life with me one day at a time." They lay together in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, the wind moving through the cottonwoods outside, the distant call of an owl beginning its nightly hunt. It was the sound of home, of safety, of a life built through intention and choice and refusing to let fear or shame dictate the limits of what was possible. Eleanor had come to New Mexico territory as Miss Hale, a woman running from everything she'd been told she could never be. She'd stayed as Mrs. Ross, discovering that the most important kind of motherhood had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with choosing to show up day after day after day. And she'd found herself, finally and completely, in the space between who she'd been expected to be and who she'd chosen to become. The woman who'd run from her own shadow had become the woman who cast light for others to follow. The teacher who'd thought she couldn't be a mother had proven that love was built through action rather than birth. The city woman who'd feared she'd never belong had claimed a home in the hardest territory and made it bloom. Hope Springs Ranch. It was more than a name. It was a truth Eleanor carried in her bones now, that hope could spring eternal even in the most unlikely soil, that broken things could be made whole again, that families were built by choice as much as by blood, and that the most important thing a person could do was stay when staying mattered. She'd stayed. And in staying, she'd discovered that she was enough, had always been enough, would always be enough. Not because someone told her so, but because she'd proven it to herself through 6 years of showing up, working hard, loving fiercely, and refusing to let anyone, including herself, define her worth by what she lacked rather than what she gave. As sleep claimed her, Eleanor's last conscious thought was of that terrified woman on the stagecoach, watching New Mexico territory unfold through dusty windows and wondering what she'd condemned herself to. If she could send a message back through time, it would be simple. Keep going. You're heading toward everything you never knew you needed, toward home, toward family, toward yourself. The morning would come with its familiar demands: livestock to tend, children to teach, a household to run, a partnership to nurture. And Eleanor would meet it as she'd met every morning since that first uncertain day, with competence and determination and the quiet certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. At Hope Springs Ranch, where a woman who'd run from her own shadow had finally found the light.